the Government Communication and Information System Service, together with the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, as well as the South African Local Government Association. It's a lot to take in. They've held a webinar this week on the impact of climate change and the changing weather patterns in the country. That comes after those devastating floods in KwaZulu-Natal, which claimed the lives of more than 430 people. There was similar flooding, I should say, in the Eastern Cape as well as the Northwest around the same period. Let's talk about South Africa's climate policy with branch manager at African Climate Reality Project, Amy Giliam. Thorp. Amy, good to have your time today. Your assessment of where South Africa is as far as making sense of climate challenges and responding adequately at a policy level.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Thembekile. So I think the first thing to point out is that South Africa does have laws and policies that respond to climate change, but overall these aren't ambitious enough. In fact, Climate Action Tracker, which is an independent research body, actually rates South Africa's current climate targets and policies as part of the Paris Agreement as insufficient. And though that's an improvement from previous years where it was highly insufficient, significant improvement, I think, as we've heard, is needed to stay within the 1.5 degree limit. We also have a constitution that does give us the right to a clean, healthy and safe environment, and that this can be used to influence and strengthen our policies. But at the moment, they're lacking in ambition, and then there are several gaps and inconsistencies. And I have a couple of examples that I'd be happy to go through if there's time available.
I think we can talk through it bit by bit. One of the other things that you've spoken about is how government needs to formulate a climate policy that is gender responsive. Why gender responsive specifically?
Sure. So that's actually one of the ones I wanted to touch on myself. So I think they need to become gender inclusive and responsive and overall respond to the needs of groups who are disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis. But the reason that we point out gender responsive specifically is that women, especially poor women, are one of the groups who bear the brunt of the climate crisis and climate shocks, and they're least likely to have the resources to cope with them. So some of the reasons being that, structural inequality in terms of access to resources, the socio-cultural norms and barriers, but also unequal policies or involvement in decision-making processes. And these all impact women's ability to adapt to and respond to climate impacts.
Let's talk about the idea of a climate change impact fund and what exactly it would do, especially in a country where South Africans are already so wary of setting up another channel where government would be handling money.
Right, sure. And I have some ideas on the latter part of that question, but I think essentially a climate fund would be a pot of money that is really paid by polluters, and those with the largest emissions. So obviously I think this is something that needs to be discussed and unpacked, and what it looks like, whether it's specifically between countries or from companies themselves. But essentially there is some kind of climate debt owed to communities and countries who are most affected but who have contributed the least to the climate crisis. But really in terms of the climate change fund, with more extreme climate events being in our future and what we've seen in KZN, these events are only going to compound each other. And there's going to be a need for rebuilding or to have access to a recovery fund so that communities are not bearing the brunt of the impact and actually paying for the cost of recoveries. What I will say is it's going to be really important that civil society organizations and other social partners are involved to track and monitor the use of these funds to really ensure that they are going to the places where they're needed the most.
There's always massive drama at the COP climate summit around the wording of the resolutions that come out of that. We saw this last year as well at the latest COP summit. And people who look at that and they question how much of a difference the actions of an individual country such as South Africa make when you consider that the massive emitters around the world are themselves trying to avoid, shall we say, strict climate rules and commitments.
Absolutely, and I think this really does speak to climate justice. I think there's a responsibility in South Africa's context, at least, because we are the 13th largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. And so even within the African context, we have a responsibility to take drastic action and, to scale up our commitments under the Paris Agreement and in terms of some of our domestic policies and laws. But at the same time, I think it's important that we recognize that there is climate debt owed from developed countries to developing countries.
Mm-hmm.
And that is part of the climate finance deal that South Africa received last year at COP26. And I think is something that's still being unpacked in terms of how that financing will work in the South African context.